What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to TTB Ravens Media, bringing Ravens content every single day for my TTB Ravens content. Make sure to hit the subscribe button down below. Turn the notification bell on if you want to get notified every single time I upload a brand new video. And as always, comment your thoughts and opinions of everything I talk about down below in the comments section. Now, before I get into the video, I want to say that this week's Live with the Viewers will not be on Saturday like it normally is. We're working on figuring out a better schedule. Joshua's got a different situation, so we think potentially Sundays could be a really good time to consistently upload. And also when it comes to the NFL season, we could possibly be doing pre-game shows and things like that, maybe post-game shows. Not 100% sure. We'll figure that out later down the line. But this week's Live with the Viewers will be Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And this is not one that you're going to want to miss, because this one we're bringing on a special guest that thinks that Josh Allen is better than Lamar Jackson. So we want to talk with him. We want to have the viewers get the reaction of, what he has to say and everything like that. We can obviously voice our opinions, pulling for Lamar and things like that. But it won't be anything different from like any of our normal shows. We'll talk about the Josh Allen stuff, but we'll also talk about any questions that you have. And he's very knowledgeable when it comes to the Ravens stuff. So it's not like, he won't be able to know anything. He has a good idea of what's going on. And it should be a lot of fun. So make sure to join the Live with the Viewers this Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. But let's get into this video. This is the second video in the series that I kind of started because there isn't a lot to talk about. So I figured, hey, a lot of football fans are also fantasy football fans. So let's look at Baltimore Ravens fantasy football options. If you haven't seen the first video I did on it, talked about Rashad Bateman and strategies that you can use with him because, kind of to sum it up, it was basically the idea that you shouldn't draft Rashad Bateman. I think a very good strategy could be a post-week 5 trade for Rashad Bateman. Because his value will be really low, because I don't expect him to put up great numbers in the first 5 weeks, especially, in that Colts game, will probably not be able to perform very well because the Colts have just such a good defense. So that if Greg Roman potentially gets fired, if anything happens, he's able to step up. But in this video, I want to look at the Ravens running back group, and I want to look at J.K. Dobbins versus Gus Edwards and comparing them in terms of fantasy football value and where/if you should even draft these players, okay? And I will say, fantasy football is not the end-all be-all when you're ranking players, okay? Just because, for example, let's look at last year. The number 4 scoring running back in fantasy football last year was Jonathan Taylor. Is Jonathan Taylor the 4th best running back in the NFL? No, he's not. He's a good running back. I don't want to take anything away from him, but he's not. Nick Chubb didn't score as many points as him. Nick Chubb is a better running back than Jonathan Taylor. However, different situations, different possibilities are created through fantasy stats that don't portray exactly how good a player is. Okay, so when I talk about things in this video, don't think that's me saying like, oh, this guy's a bad player. Some may think that they have bad fantasy options in certain settings. But now getting into it, if we just look at last year, we can look at J.K. Dobbins, according to NFL Fantasy, which uses, I'm pretty sure they use standard scoring, 1 point for every 10 yards, 6 points for a touchdown. I don't know if they have PPR in this. I don't believe they do. But so when I'm talking about things, I don't play PPR typically. I've played it in the past. I enjoy it. I don't despise PPR or anything like that. But J.K. Dobbins was the number 17 running back. Purely based off of rushing. He scored 150.50 points. Pretty solid. He was right in front of Mike Davis, and he was right behind Chris Carson. And Mike Davis, obviously the running back that took over for Christian McCaffrey when he went down with injury. So J.K. Dobbins obviously played well. Now, you would also have to look at that and realize, hey, he wasn't getting a ton of snaps at the beginning of the season, and he definitely picked up his play towards the end of the season. If you remember, he had, I believe it was 6 consecutive weeks where he scored a touchdown, absolutely dominant towards the end of the season, very reliable and everything like that. So you have to take that into consideration. You can't just look at the totals. You have to realize, okay, he was a rookie. He wasn't played very much initially, but eventually he kind of took over that number 1 running back spot. Then we look at Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards finished as running back 28 with 119.2 points. Now, Gus Edwards, he was somebody who was kind of the same guy the entire year. He was kind of the number 2 to Mark Ingram, which was ridiculous. Mark Ingram was not very good last year. And I don't want to blame Mark Ingram for that. I think him being a veteran, him being an older running back, not having training camp, I think really hurt his body. It's like he didn't get that stretch before he went out onto the Y and tried to play basketball. But Gus Edwards kind of number 2 to him. Then JK really started to surge, and JK pretty much took Mark Ingram's stuff, and they kind of were interchangeable towards the end of the season. JK, I think, was more dominant. However, Gus Edwards still played very solid football. So if you're looking at that and you're thinking, okay, J.K. Dobbins surged, and at the end of the year, he was pretty solid. And I will say, I think J.K. Dobbins is the better fantasy option if you had to pick outright, Gus Edwards or J.K. I would want J.K. However, in fantasy football, there's a lot to do with value. J.K. Dobbins is going to be drafted significantly higher than Gus Edwards in every form of draft, especially dynasty, especially, PPR, in any, redraft, all those situations. JK is going to go first. Why? Because he's a young player. He went to a big school and he had a very good rookie season, and people are going to expect a massive increase in that. So is that value going to be worth it for JK? I don't think so. I don't think JK is worth it just because he's still in a massive running back by committee backfield. And you may say, oh, but it's only 2 running backs. Sort of. They got 3 rushers though. Okay. Lamar's not a running back. However, he takes a significant amount of carries away from the running backs. And that's something that you have to keep in mind. The Ravens may have a 300-yard rushing game. They may have a 250-yard rushing game. And it's like, oh, JK had 50 yards as the number 1 running back. But Lamar had 130, and Gus Edwards broke a big one, had 115. And then it's like, oh, but JK, he didn't do that well in particular weeks. And that's the type of thing that can happen when you have a running back by committee backfield where it's not a particular role. It's different from, the Felix Jones, Marion Barber backfield, where Felix Jones was the guy that would get 110 yards rushing, and Marion Barber would get 8 carries for 7 yards and 2 touchdowns. It's different from that dynamic. They both basically swap off each drive. If you're looking at it for scoring touchdowns, I would think that JK would be better in that aspect because the Ravens did use him more in goal line situations, which is surprising. I think people that aren't Ravens fans don't expect that. They would expect the guy who's nicknamed the Bus to be the goal line back. However, JK is seemingly the goal line back for the Ravens. So touchdown wise, he definitely provides that value. However, I just think that him being in that backfield is going to really restrict his minutes, no matter how good he is. I've said it before, J.K. Dobbins could very well become a top 5 running back in the NFL. However, he will never get that recognition because he's never going to be putting up the stats that top 5 running backs are expected to put up, because he's going to be in a running back by committee most likely his entire time in Baltimore, because the Ravens just run the ball so often, and they run the ball with their quarterback so often. It just takes away from his snaps, and so he's not going to get that recognition. But he's still a great player. I love J.K. Dobbins. I think he's probably already a top 10 talent running back in the NFL. But looking at Gus Edwards is still a known fantasy option. He is not somebody that's like, oh, he's flying under the radar. Last year it was like that. It was like, oh, nobody's going to go for Gus. Gus is tricky. Gus is very tricky in fantasy because he is a guy that Ravens fans know he's solid for the Ravens. He's a good running back for the Baltimore Ravens. However, fantasy-wise, he isn't amazing, and he may get a couple of big games. That's the thing. JK and Gus will both have probably 5 100-yard games, at least. That's how good they are. The Ravens' run game will have a significant amount of massive games. However, it's going to be flip-flopping. And in my opinion, looking at that, I don't think either of these players are players that you want in fantasy, because yes, the upside is there. However, the downside is the floor is very low for these players on a week-to-week basis, not because of skill, but because of opportunity. It may just happen to work out that, maybe you start J.K. Dobbins and all of a sudden Gus that week, he goes on 4 drives, but the Ravens do very well on those 4 drives, and he gets 3 rushing touchdowns. And J.K., the Ravens still did well, but they were kind of passing a lot on those drives. And Lamar threw for 2 or 3 touchdowns on that. And it's like, oh, man, JK got 37 yards. He played well. He got 37 yards. He was an efficient 37 yards. But, Gus Edwards got a lot of things. And that's just very tricky to gauge. That's very tricky to predict because it's all situational. And that's not something that I like when I'm looking at a running back. If I want a running back, I want a guy to know that, like, hey, if I start this guy, he's going to be solid. And if you're looking at them at bench options, that's fair. However, if you need him to perform in week 7 or whatever it is that you have him as a bench option for, you're really banking on that week 7 not being a flop, because it's the worst when you have a bench player, you put them in and then they absolutely flop, because it's just unfortunate. And whatever you do, don't draft both of them. And I will say, I'm giving all this advice. If you want to play fantasy football and pick all your favorite players, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. This is for, if you want to pick whoever you want, absolutely go for it. Like, if you're just doing fantasy football for fun, you're in a family league, a league full of Ravens fans or whatever, completely okay. But if you're in a paid league, you're trying to win the league, I honestly don't think that either of these guys are viable fantasy options, just because they're in that running back by committee. I think J.K. Dobbins is going to be overvalued in a lot of leagues because, he had such a good rookie season. However, I think that it's just going to be a running back by committee, and it's going to be it's going to be wavering every week. Oh, J.K. 30 points. Oh, J.K. 8 points. 24. J.K. got 3. Dang. But in offset weeks, Gus Edwards played really well. The only strategy that I could really see that could potentially work, which I would not recommend whatsoever, I think it'd be a terrible strategy. But if you had both of them and you started them every week, like, you could be like, hey, yeah, you play the Ravens running back committee. I don't think that would be very smart. I think there would definitely be better options that you could use. But, like, if you were going to do something, do that. But I think that's a terrible idea. But let me know in the comment section down below. If you're a fantasy football player, do you plan on drafting these guys? Where do you have them ranked? What do you think they'll do? What is your strategy with them? Thank you, everybody. Subscribe for daily Ravens content. And I will see all of you again tomorrow.